All right, so everybody should have completed reading Harrison Bergeron. You should be posting in the discussion that I have set up. But this lecture is mostly going to deal with Harrison Bergeron and touch on some critical analysis. Now, this assigned reading is going to be the topic for paper number 1, which is the critical analysis paper. So the critical approaches lecture, make sure you read through that, make sure you watch that, and make sure you read the handout that's posted with it. The rubric for that paper includes all of the critical approaches, and you can go through those and look them over. The lecture should clarify some of them, but do not hesitate to contact me if you have questions about them. Typically, people find 2 or 3 that they really like, and then on discussing with me, select the one that they feel most comfortable with working on their paper. So, Harrison Bergeron is a short story set in the future that depicts a dystopian or utopian society depending on your perspective. In this story, we see 2 people depicted, Hazel and George, who are husband and wife, and they live in a society that's not too far removed from 1984, where pretty much everything that they do is monitored and has the potential for severe punishment if it results in some infraction of the social laws. So what we immediately know about the society is that everybody has been made equal. And superficially, that is something that we strive for in contemporary society, but we approach it from a different way, where we find those who are disadvantaged and try and elevate them to equality among peers. This society has determined that the easiest or most efficient way to make everybody equal is to reduce everybody from high potential to lower potential. So I like to put it this way. Think of the stupidest person you know, and now imagine what life would be like if nobody were allowed to be smarter than that person. So, in this society, intelligence is limited, athleticism is limited, beauty is limited, and other skills are limited as well. It unfolds very slowly but surely. But George appears to be a more intelligent individual. We can tell that because he has a device that prevents him from thinking coherently. Hazel, on the other hand, has some difficulties with cognitive thought. She runs into memory issues and things like that. So we have 2 fairly different people on here, but the story isn't really about them. It's about their son, Harrison, who has been remanded into custody because he goes above and beyond what any restraints, whether they be intellectual or other, are capable of dealing with. And he breaks from prison and finds his way to a TV studio where this ballet is being taped. And at the age of 14, he does what most 14-year-olds would do and tries to make a spectacle of himself. First thing he does is remove all of his restraints, and we find that he is a 7-foot-tall, athletically and intellectually gifted young man who is also apparently very good-looking because they have shaved his eyebrows off and make him wear a clown nose and thick-lensed glasses and things like that. Now, this whole thing is unfolding in front of Hazel and George, but they really don't understand it because George isn't allowed to think, and Hazel doesn't really have the capacity to connect the dots and remember this is her son and things like that. So, Hazel and George are watching as their son, essentially skipping a lot of the story, is gunned down by the handicapper general, and life returns to what passes for normal in this society. What is really critical to keep in mind about this reading is that it is not overtly condemning or condoning anything that's presented in it. Where most authors will take a very strong stance for or against a specific political or social ideology. Vonnegut here does a really interesting thing in leaving it up to you. Do you think he's in favor of a society that is equal or not? Do you think that he's in favor of a society that uses fascist authoritarian tactics to enforce equality or not? Both perspectives are valid in the context of critical analysis. For example, a formalist would argue that this story is making a political argument that everybody should be forced to be equal, and then points out all the sources in the story that support that observation, that it succeeds in that. You know, in this society, there's very little crime. Nobody envies anyone. There shouldn't be any theft. Potentially, nobody would have self-esteem issues if everybody's the same. So on paper, it works. It's good. It succeeds. A deconstructionist might argue that it fails to support that perspective that everybody should be equal, because Harrison Bergeron risks and loses his own life in the pursuit of being better than everybody else, which is not different than contemporary society for us. If we were to apply biographical critical analysis, for example, we could apply it to the characters in that reading. For example, Harrison Bergeron is raised in a dystopian, fascist, authoritarian society, if we want to call it that. Where does he get his streak of rebellion? Is it because he's that intelligent? Has he read some sort of book that might inspire that in him? Has all literature just been overlooked in them sweeping through and preventing everybody from intellectual achievement? We don't know, but we might be able to speculate. What is the easiest way to create a rebellious teen? As most of you are former teenagers or current teenagers, you can probably relate to that real well. Imposing draconian rules on a teenager is the quickest way to get a teenager to rebel. I remember my teenage years, and my peers and I typically resisted any new rules that were applied to us. Biographical critical approach could also be applied to the author. What was going on in Vonnegut's life? When was this story published? If you look at the publication history, it was published in 1967. What was going on at that time in the United States? Historical critical approach would be kind of similar. Biographical critical approach looks at events that occurred in an author's life that affected him personally, whereas historical looks at things from a more global or holistic perspective. What is going on in the world? Well, everybody is trying to be equal. Women's liberation movement is occurring. The civil rights movement is occurring at the same time. There are other movements that I'm just not able to pull out of thin air at the moment. But the world was changing rapidly in the 1960s when Vonnegut wrote this. He could probably look out his window and see people demonstrating for a lower voting age or raising the draft age and things like that, and started musing on equality. You know, people did not get to go out and protest peacefully and go home. Many of them were bludgeoned by police officers, had fire hoses turned on them. At Kent State in 1970, they were shot and killed for protesting. All of that is contributing to an ideal that is being perpetuated by this story. Now, does he think these are stupid teenagers for resisting the authority of their adult class, the ruling class? Is he encouraging that? All of this is something in the context of critical analysis that you, as an author, have to claim. Every single critical approach, and I'm going to go through the rest of them as well, requires you to make a claim and sort of put yourself out there. What do you get from this story? Once again, the sole reason that I chose this is that he doesn't have an overt bias one way or the other. You have to make the claim. With With sociological critical approach, we're looking at how an author or how a character interacts with the society around them. How does Harrison Bergeron interact with society? How is he different from his parents? You know, Harrison Bergeron is this firebrand of a rebel leader. He's like the John Connor, for those of you who are familiar with the Terminator films, of his generation, while his dad knows all of the rules that govern the weights hanging around his own neck. Massive fine and jail time for each pellet removed from this sack, so no thank you, I'm not risking myself for this. How did Vonnegut interact with his society? Was he sort of a social outcast? Was he rebellious? Was he pro-authoritarian? Look at how he interacted with that society. Psychological critical approach is a little bit more challenging and a little bit more demanding because you can't just play armchair psychiatrist and say, well, the character was paranoid because of the following reasons and therefore can be diagnosed as paranoid. You look at what sort of psychological issues are challenging that individual, and you are going to need to support those claims. So the Journal of American Psychological Diagnosticians, or whatever that one is called, you would have to go through and find a definition for that to support your claim that the character is paranoid or suffers from OCD or any of those other psychological ailments that the character is apparently dealing with. Mythological criticism, on the other hand, sort of looks for how those Jungian archetypes or other elements of the story contribute to the tropes that we're familiar with our fantasy stories or our science fiction stories. Does Harrison Bergeron personify a noble hero? I mean, is he trying to change life for anyone else? Is he a selfless sort of savior of all mankind? You could argue yes, you could argue no. As soon as he breaks out of prison, the first thing he does is go and try to find himself a girlfriend. Is that consistent with most of our heroes? No. Captain America comes out of his ice block, and the first thing he's concerned with is making sure that the Nazis and Hydra are stopped, for example. Mythological critical approach can be applied in a lot of different ways. This is probably the only one where you won't pay as much attention to the author, but you can certainly look at where the author is coming from and see if he had some sort of underlying intent, sort of like when C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia as sort of a parable for his Christian perspective. You know, he is actually trying to create those Jungian archetypes with Aslan as a messiah figure. And so that messiah figure probably would personify the noble hero archetype, the trickster, things like that that show up in there you can identify using mythological approach. Let's see, we've done formalist, deconstructionist, biographical, sociological, historical, and the other ones. Reader response is really interesting because you have to identify your connection to the reading. Are you male? Are you female? Are you a teenager? Are you an adult? Socially, do you interact with people in a certain way? Reader response really approaches criticism from your own reaction and your own compartmentalization of those sources that you're analyzing. Let me see here. What are we missing? I think we're up to 7, so that leaves gender criticism, which seems to overlap a little bit, slightly, with the themes that you might see in psychological critical approach, but focuses more on sort of a gender criticism has a lot of different facets to it. You can choose several of them to work with, or you can isolate single ones. You might perform a masculine criticism. How does this reading sort of fit into a male perspective? You know, Harrison Bergeron finds himself in this situation where he is not respecting women, he's just demanding one be his empress. Is that consistent with a masculine sort of misogynist perspective? On the reverse side, if you explore it from a feminist perspective, does this reading really denigrate women as the weaker sex? The person with all the authority in this reading is actually a female, or has a female name at least, Diana Moon Glampers. Gender criticism also incorporates queer theory, which, despite having sort of an un-PC name, looks at criticism from the perspective of gender identity and sexual orientation identity. So from the perspective of a homosexual, a heterosexual, a bisexual, or any of the other within the sort of LGBTQ spectrum, how does that identity affect the reader interacting with the work, and how does it affect the author? Was the author closeted? Was the author heterosexual? Things like that are considerations that fall into gender criticism, which are all perfectly appropriate in the context. Reading it based on your own gender identity, do you find that it falls flat? Because the idea of a society where beauty is masked might also eliminate the concept of gender. You know, we are told that the ballerinas are all female, but how do we know if they're all covered up? So gender criticism can be a really enriching one to apply. Let me see here. We've gone through formalist, deconstructionist, biosociological, historical, psychological, gender response, psych. That should be all of them. So that is really a rough approach to applying them to Harrison Bergeron, completely off the cuff. Having read through it, you should be able to look at that sheet and see which, I'm trying to say gender here, but see which critical approaches you feel most comfortable applying to it. Next step is to either choose one and start developing a thesis statement, or to choose one and contact me to discuss how to develop a thesis statement. Please, once again, this is not the sort of course where you are stuck in the deep end with no help. You should feel free to contact me whenever via email. We can even set up a video chat. This Zoom app allows you to chat with me face-to-face if you can't get enough of my annoying northern accent. So think this stuff over, consider the themes in Harrison Bergeron, and start developing an idea for your paper. Thanks.